All right, let's jump into today's deep dive. We're tackling the Dublin Unified School District's budget woes, up in California. We've got this recent article from the Dublin News about all these proposed cuts, and, well, it's concerning, to say the least. We're going to break it all down for you, help you understand what's going on and what it all means. And get this, ready for a head scratcher. This district, right smack in one of the wealthiest states in the country, gets way less funding per student than the state average. Like, significantly less. It's baffling, really. So let's unpack this, shall we?
Yeah, it's definitely a situation that raises some eyebrows. You're looking at a pretty hefty deficit here, not just a small hiccup. We're talking $6.3 million short for the upcoming school year.
6.3 million. Wow. That's
Yeah.
that's a big hole to dig out of. What happens if a district can't cover a deficit like that? What are we even talking about here?
Well, if they can't maintain a 3% reserve, which is a pretty standard requirement, they're in serious danger of a county takeover.
County takeover. Yikes. Okay, so high stakes for sure. How did they get here? The article mentions something about a cost of living adjustment, or KLA. Was that a big factor?
Keole is a critical piece of the puzzle, for sure. It's meant to help schools keep up with, well, the cost of living, inflation, all that. Basically, it adjusts funding and salary so schools can, actually function. Now, this year, the governor's office, they decided to reduce Dublin Unified's KLA, went from 2.93% down to 2.43%.
Seems kind of small, a fraction of a percent.
Well, it might not sound like much, but for a district this size, we're talking about a loss of over $360,000.
Ah, okay, so even seemingly tiny percentages, they can really snowball into big problems. Was there a reason given for, specifically reducing their QLA?
The article doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but it's worth remembering that, the state's budget has its own limitations. These kinds of adjustments, they often reflect those larger economic and political trends. This KLA reduction probably isn't unique to Dublin, likely impacts other districts as well.
Makes sense. Everything's connected. Now, the article also pointed out this pretty shocking fact. Dublin Unified gets way less per student funding than the state average. The numbers were, let me see, $11,167 for Dublin compared to, wait for it, $14,099 statewide. How does that even happen? I mean, California, it's not exactly known for skimping on education or...
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
It really comes down to how California funds its schools.
Yeah.
The formula they use, it's primarily based on two things, enrollment and attendance.
So basically, more butts and seats, more money.
You get districts with lower numbers in those areas, well, they get less funding.
Doesn't that seem kind of, I don't know, unfair? Like, what about districts with unique needs? Maybe they're growing quickly or have, more students who need extra support.
Yeah, you're hitting on a major point of contention with the current system.
Yeah.
It doesn't always account for individual circumstances. Some folks argue it creates a system where some districts are, set up to struggle from the get-go.
So it sounds like this funding formula, it's a pretty big piece of the puzzle for Dublin, right? But are there any other factors at play here? Anything else contributing to this budget mess?
Oh, absolutely. Remember all that COVID relief money? Those federal funds?
Yeah, a lot of districts were relying on that.
Well, those funds have dried up, expired, and Dublin's no exception. A lot of districts are in the same boat, trying to figure out how to make up for that lost income.
So they're losing those emergency funds, and at the same time, they're already getting less money because of this wonky funding formula. Feels like they're getting hit from all sides, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough spot. And there's another layer of complexity here. Unfunded mandates.
Unfunded mandates. Okay, gotta admit, I'm not super familiar with that term. What does that even mean?
Basically, it's when the state or federal government says, hey, you got to do this, like implement a specific program. And here's the kicker. They don't give you the money to actually do it.
So the district is forced to foot the bill for something they didn't even choose.
Pretty much. Think about programs like special education, super important, right? But they can also be really expensive.
And I'm guessing the state doesn't always cover the full cost.
You got it. It forces districts, especially ones already strapped for cash, to make some really tough choices about where to allocate their limited resources.
Yeah, not a good position to be in at all. And to top it all off, enrollment's going down too, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. The article mentions a projected drop of 260 students by 2030.
And since funding is tied to enrollment, that probably means...
Even less money down the line. It's like a vicious cycle,
So we've got this perfect storm brewing, immediate funding shortages, a funding formula that puts them at a disadvantage, and the looming threat of even tighter budgets in the future.
It paints a pretty stark picture of the challenges facing Dublin Unified, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, and we haven't even gotten to the actual cuts yet. But before we dive into that, let's take a quick pause, catch our breath, let everything sink in. We've covered a lot of ground here. COLA, funding formulas, mandates, enrollment projections.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure, but it's all crucial context for understanding what's happening in Dublin. Sets the stage for understanding why these proposed cuts are so, well, controversial, to say the least.
All right, so we've established the districts in a real bind. Let's get into the weeds of these proposed cuts and see how they're trying to navigate this whole mess.
That's a good place to start, for sure. These cuts, they really highlight the tough choices the district's facing right now.
Let's start with the non-labor cuts. What are some of the areas they're looking at?
Well, they're considering delaying those solar loan payments. That could free up a good chunk of change in the short term, something like $1.6 million. Also talking about postponing equipment replacements, things like copiers and TVs, stuff that can maybe wait. And then there's the idea of scaling back on contracted services, things that aren't directly handled by district employees.
Delaying loans and putting off upgrades, that sounds like kicking the can down the road a bit, doesn't it?
It's a valid concern. Delaying those payments now could just lead to higher costs later on, potentially even more than what they save initially.
Yeah, I guess you can only put off those things for so long. And the equipment, too. It's easy to think of that as a minor thing, but I imagine outdated technology, that can really make things harder for everyone.
Exactly. It impacts the quality of education, creates inefficiencies. It's like trying to run a modern school on, dial-up internet. Just doesn't work.
Makes sense. Now, what about those contracted services? What kinds of things are we talking about there?
Things like transportation, food services, professional development for teachers, all sorts of stuff.
So cutting back on those, that could directly impact students' day-to-day stuff.
Absolutely. Cutting transportation makes it harder for kids to get to school, impacts attendance, all that. Reducing food services, well, that affects kids' nutrition, their ability to focus in class. And limiting professional development. Well, teachers need to stay up to date, learn new techniques if we want the best for our kids.
Right, they got to keep learning, too. It's not like they just, graduate from teacher school and that's it. So it seems like these non-labor cuts, they're intended to save money, but they could also have all these unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a classic example of the ripple effect. These things are all interconnected, and you got to consider the big picture.
Now, let's get into the personnel cuts, the stuff everyone's really worried about.
Yeah, these are the ones that hit close to home, for sure. Affect people's jobs, livelihoods, not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
What's on the table here?
They're talking about eliminating assistant principal positions, reducing overall admin hours.
And what about the teachers? That's what everyone's really nervous about, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. Looks like they're proposing to cut around 15 classroom teaching positions, which means larger class sizes pretty much across the board.
I can only imagine how stressful that would be for teachers and students, both already stretched thin as is.
It's a huge concern. Smaller class sizes, especially in the early grades, they're so important for kids learning for their development. Larger classes, they make it so much harder for teachers to give individual attention, to really connect with each student.
And haven't they done studies showing that smaller classes actually lead to better outcomes for kids?
Absolutely. Tons of research backs that up. And it's not just about academics either. Larger classes can impact kids' social and emotional development too. It's harder to build relationships, foster a sense of community when you've got 30-plus kids in a room.
Yeah, it's a recipe for chaos, for burnout. It's like, how can anyone thrive in that environment?
Exactly. Teachers get overwhelmed, burned out, and ultimately, it's the kids who suffer. The quality of education takes a hit.
The article also mentioned something about reorganizing counselor positions, using funding from outside the district's general fund.
Right, they're looking at shifting the burden, basically. Yeah. But it doesn't really address the core issue. Not enough resources for those crucial support services.
Feels like a Band-Aid solution. What happens if those external funds dry up?
It's a real risk. It creates so much uncertainty, makes it harder to attract and retain good counselors. And without enough counselors, students don't get the support they need, whether it's academic or personal.
So it's like a chain reaction, right? One cut leads to another, and ultimately it's the students who bear the brunt of it. Well, this is all pretty bleak. Are there any areas they're trying to protect? Any silver linings here?
The superintendent, Chris Funk, he seems committed to finding the money for counselors and mental health professionals, even if it means making cuts elsewhere.
Good. At least someone's prioritizing that. It's more important than ever these days, you know?
Absolutely. But then you've got the board president, Kristen Speck. She's suggesting they reduce spending on books and supplies per student. She points out Dublin spends way more on that stuff compared to other districts.
I can see both sides, honestly. On one hand, yeah, maybe there's some fat to trim, but you also don't want to be, penny pinching when it comes to kids' learning materials.
It's a tough call. The board's got to weigh those trade-offs carefully, figure out what their priorities are.
So we've got the proposed cuts, and we've got the board, well, not exactly seeing eye to eye on everything. But what does all this mean for the people actually in the district? The students, the teachers, the families? What are the real-world consequences here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've talked about class sizes, support services, learning materials, all that. But the real story is about the human impact. These cuts, they have the potential to ripple through the entire community.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, but we can't forget we're talking about real people's lives here. This is a community, not just a bunch of budget lines.
Exactly. And the decisions made in the coming weeks, they'll have a real impact, a lasting impact on everyone involved. It really does make you think, about the assumptions we make about where money is and isn't when it comes to schools.
Right. Like we always hear about good school districts, bad school districts. It's also tied to location, to property taxes, all that.
And it creates this narrative that, well, if a district's struggling, it must be because, the community isn't doing enough, not contributing enough.
But here's Dublin, in the heart of the Bay Area, tech money everywhere. And they're facing these massive cuts. It's eye-opening, for sure.
Definitely makes you question those easy assumptions.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those long-term consequences, the real-world impact of all this. What are we looking at here? What happens when a district starts making these kinds of cuts? What's the human cost, so to speak?
Well, we've already touched on some of it, right? Larger class sizes, fewer resources, less support for students and teachers.
Right, and all of that has a ripple effect, doesn't it? It's not just about, tightening belts. It's about the quality of education, the well-being of the entire community.
Exactly. Think about it this way. When you pack more kids into a classroom, what happens? It becomes so much harder for teachers to give each student the attention they need, the individualized support.
Especially for kids who are already struggling, right? Kids with learning differences, kids who need that extra help.
Exactly. It creates this widening gap where the kids who are already behind, well, they fall even further behind.
And it's not just about academics either, is it? It's about their social and emotional development, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you've got a classroom bursting at the seams, it's harder to build relationships, to create that sense of community. It's harder for teachers to, really see each student, to address their individual needs.
It becomes less about learning and more about, just managing the chaos.
Yeah, it's a recipe for frustration, for burnout, for both teachers and students.
And, teachers are already feeling the pressure, right? They're stretched thin, underpaid, often dealing with, all these external pressures.
Exactly. And then you add larger class sizes, fewer resources. It's unsustainable.
Yeah.
It leads to burnout, to teacher turnover, and ultimately, it's the kids who pay the price.
And we can't forget about those potential cuts to counseling services and mental health support. That's a big one, right?
Huge. Kids are dealing with so much these days. Stress, anxiety, social media pressures, all of it. And access to mental health support is essential. If we take that away, well, the consequences could be pretty dire.
Yeah, it's not just about, helping kids deal with a bad day. It's about giving them the tools to navigate life's challenges, to develop healthy coping mechanisms.
And without that support, we're likely to see an increase in everything. Behavioral problems, mental health issues, even substance abuse.
It's like we're setting them up to fail almost by not giving them the support they need.
It's a domino effect. One thing leads to another. And it impacts the whole community, not just individual students.
So we've got these potential cuts that could lead to a whole host of negative consequences. But it's not just about the tangible stuff, right? It's also about the message this sends, the message to the students, to the teachers, to the community as a whole.
Yeah, when we cut funding for education, what are we really saying? Are we saying that our kids' future is a priority? Are we valuing the hard work of our teachers?
It sends a message of, of apathy, of disregard. It erodes trust, creates this sense of disillusionment.
Absolutely. And that impacts everyone, the entire community. Public education, it's the foundation of a thriving society. When we invest in education, we're investing in our future. But when we cut funding, when we make these deep cuts, well, we're essentially shortchanging our kids and jeopardizing the well-being of our entire community.
So where do we go from here? It feels like this district, like so many others, is stuck in this vicious cycle, this downward spiral of cuts and declining quality.
It's a tough situation for sure, and there's no easy answer. But I think the first step is to acknowledge the severity of the problem. We can't just pretend this is normal, that this is just how it is. We have to have honest conversations about our priorities, about what we value as a society.
And those conversations, they have to involve everyone, right? Not just the school board, not just the administrators.
Exactly. We need parents, teachers, students, community members, business leaders. Everyone needs to be at the table.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people. It's about the future of our community.
Right. And we can't just sit back and accept these cuts as inevitable. We have to fight for our schools, for our kids, for the future we want to build.
This deep dive, it's been a lot to process, a lot of tough realities to confront. But it's also been a call to action, a reminder that we can't just sit on the sidelines and hope for the best. For those of you listening, what are your takeaways? What are your thoughts on all this? We've explored the data, the potential consequences, the human cost of these budget cuts. But the real story, the story that matters most, is the story of what happens next. What choices will we make? What kind of future will we create for our kids, for our community? Dublin Unified School District is at crossroads, a turning point. And the decisions made in the coming weeks, they'll have a ripple effect, for better or for worse, for years to come. Stay informed, get involved, make your voice heard. The future of our schools, of our community, depends on it.
It really is a wake-up call, isn't it? Like, we tend to think of these problems as, something that happens over there in those underfunded districts.
Yeah, we kind of distance ourselves from it, like, that's a shame, but it's not my problem.
But this situation with Dublin, it really throws a wrench in that whole narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah, makes you realize that these issues, they can pop up anywhere, even in communities that, on the surface, seem to have it all figured out. Okay, so we've talked about the numbers, the budget shortfalls, all that. But let's zoom out a bit and focus on the human side of the story. What are the real-world consequences of these cuts, especially for the students? What are we risking here?
Well, we talked about larger class sizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that might not seem like a huge deal to some folks, but it really does impact the quality of education.
Yeah.
Think about it. When you have like 30, 35 kids in a class, it's impossible for teachers to give each student the individualized attention they need.
Yeah, I remember being in some pretty packed classes back in the day, and it was tough, even for the kids who were, doing well. I can't imagine how much harder it would be for students who are already struggling, who need that extra help.
Exactly. And that's what's so concerning about these cuts. It creates this situation where the students who are already at a disadvantage, well, they're the ones who suffer the most.
So we're talking about a potential widening of the achievement gap, right? The kids who need the most help fall even further behind.
That's the risk. And it's not just about academics either. It's about their social and emotional development, their ability to, thrive in a classroom setting.
Right, because when you've got that many kids in a room, it's more about crowd control than actual learning, isn't it?
It becomes harder to build relationships, to foster a sense of community, to create a space where kids feel safe and supported.
And let's be honest, teachers are already burnt out, overwhelmed, dealing with all sorts of stuff.
Exactly. And then you add larger class sizes, fewer resources. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and eventually those teachers, the good ones, they're going to say, I'm out. They'll go somewhere they feel valued, where they can actually make a difference.
And then what? You're left with even fewer teachers, even larger class sizes, and the cycle just continues.
And we can't forget about the potential cuts to counseling services, to mental health support. That's a big one, right? Especially these days when kids are facing so much pressure, so much anxiety.
It's essential. We're talking about kids' mental health, their well-being. Taking away those support systems, that's a huge risk.
Yeah, it's not just about, helping kids deal with a bad day. It's about giving them the tools to navigate life, to build resilience.
And without that support, well, we're likely to see an increase in all sorts of problems, behavioral issues, mental health crises, maybe even substance abuse.
It's like, are we setting these kids up for failure by taking away the very things they need to succeed?
It's a real concern. And it's not just about the individual students either. It impacts the whole community.
Right, because when kids are struggling, families are struggling, and the whole community suffers. So it's not just about budget cuts, is it? It's about the values we hold as a society, the message we're sending to our kids.
Yeah, when we make these deep cuts to education, what are we really saying? Are we saying that our kids' future is a priority?
It feels like we're saying, you're on your own, figure it out.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty bleak message, especially for young people who are already facing so much uncertainty.
It's demoralizing, it's disheartening, and it creates this sense of hopelessness, not just for the students, but for the teachers, for the whole community.
Yeah, it erodes trust, creates division, and makes it that much harder to come together and find solutions. So where do we go from here? What can we do? It feels like we're stuck in this downward spiral.
It's a tough question, no easy answers. But I think the first step is to acknowledge the problem, to really see it for what it is. And then we have to have those tough conversations, the ones about priorities, about what we're willing to invest in as a society.
And those conversations, they have to involve everyone, right? Not just the people in power, but the students, the teachers, the parents, the entire community.
Exactly. We need everyone at the table, working together to find solutions that actually work, solutions that put our kids first.
Because ultimately, this isn't about politics, it's not about budgets, it's about people. It's about the kind of future we want to create.
And that future, it starts with education. It starts with investing in our kids, in our communities, in the things that truly matter.
Well, this deep dive, it's been a lot to process, a lot of tough realities to confront, but it's also been a reminder that we have a choice. We can choose to accept the status quo, to let these cuts continue, to let our schools and our communities crumble, or we can choose to fight back, to demand better, to create a future where every child has the opportunity to thrive. Dublin Unified School District, it's just one example of a much larger problem, a problem that's impacting communities all across the country. But it's also a reminder that we have the power to change things, to create a better future for our kids, for our communities, for ourselves. So get informed, get involved, make your voice heard. The future of our schools, the future of our communities, it depends on us. It depends on what we do next.